Hello, and welcome to Self-Care is Sexy. My name is Chris, and I'll be your host. We're a podcast that's here to generate and share self-care ideas with each other. Last episode was about what's going well and how to level up your self-care by focusing on your progress rather than your perfection. And this is a great episode to listen to if you're already doing like some kind of self-care, but you're kind of feeling like maybe you're in a rut or whatever you're doing for self-care just needs like a little extra boost in your routine. So check out that episode. You can listen to us on SoundCloud, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, iTunes, and anywhere else you get your podcasts from. I want to give you a preview of what to expect from today's episode. So today, we're going to be talking about what do you do when you just don't feel like doing any self-care, or if you're not motivated to make yourself your priority today. We've got some really great tips on how to get unstuck from that suck. But first, a few quick housekeeping notes. All right, so today we're going to talk about what do you do if you feel like you don't want to really do self-care or you're not motivated to take care of yourself in any way, shape, or form. Because on this show, we talk about a lot of ideas on how to get self-care. We talk about like what gets in the way or prevents you from getting the self-care that you need, or even what happens when you don't get the self-care that you need. But today, we're actually going to address what happens when you just don't feel like doing self-care, because that happens a lot. Whether it's depression or anxiety or overwhelm, whatever it is, sometimes you just don't feel like taking care of yourself. And that's 100% okay. So today we're going to be talking about kind of identifying what that feeling is and maybe where it's coming from. And then we're going to talk about some different self-care ideas that might be a little exciting and new, that might spur your creativity and to get you to do some ideas that you might not otherwise think of as self-care. But what's really important to think about is that every time you do self-care, even when you're not, especially when you're not thinking about it, you actually develop within your brain this pattern that makes you more willing and more hungry to get self-care. It's just the same way of like drinking water. So if you're ever like working on drinking more water, which we all should. So right now, if you have water near you anywhere, grab it, take a giant gulp. You're welcome. 100% hydration is an act of self-care. So right there, you got a W before we even got through the intro today. What you'll find is that as you do self-care, even little tiny acts like just drinking that sip of water, as you continually do those little acts of self-care, your habit brain will start getting used to it and it'll start craving it, because really, your brain is just it's like a broken giant repeat machine. It wants everything to be really super easy and super simple, and it loves doing the same thing over and over again, whether that's drinking your water or whether that's self-care in general. So it's absolutely true that the more you do self-care, the more you're going to crave it, the more you're going to want it, and the more you're going to notice when you don't have it. But it's totally normal to 100% of the time run up against a wall of just not feeling like you want to do self-care. And there's a lot of reasons that you might not feel like doing self-care. There's a lot going on. You know, it could be overwhelm, it could be stress, it could be a bunch of things. But what we really want to talk about today, we want to drill down and identify what it is you're feeling that's making you not want to do self-care. Because depending on what's causing you to not want to take care of yourself right now, that will really determine what kind of self-care you're going to need. And as with everything, I hope that if you've listened to the show long enough, you start to get that sense that I'm a big proponent of not doing massive overhauls. anytime I see like a diet plan or an Instagram post or anything that's like completely revolutionize your life in 30 days, like no fucking way, go the other direction. That is not plausible. It's not even an act of self-care. It's exactly the opposite, because we are not designed as human beings, this like, as we're starting to learn about neuroplasticity and the way our brains work, we are not designed to do well or succeed with massive overhauls or huge changes. That's why when you want to go on a diet and you like clean out your fridge and clean out your pantry, that like a month later, you're right back to where you were. Your brain is much more optimal and primed to make changes in very tiny, small, incremental percentage changes. And I really want you to hang on to that today as we talk about not feeling like self-care or not knowing what to do for self-care or what's causing that feeling. Because if you start to identify with some of these feelings and you're nodding your head, yes, and you're like, Chris, I completely identify with what you're talking about. I don't want that to be a trigger for your brain to go, all right, let's like tear everything down and start all over. That's not what this is about. This is about being able to identify the feeling that you're having that's preventing you from doing self-care so that you can personalize what self-care you're going to do. And you're going to do that in small incremental changes. So let's start out by nailing down the feeling that is preventing us from getting our self-care in. So number one, you just don't feel like it. It's when you're not feeling particularly motivated or excited to do something. And it really feels like this rebellious feeling inside, right? When it's just like, I don't want to. Like, eating your vegetables and drinking your water and getting exercise, those things are good for you. That's not rocket science. We're not, creating anything new here. But no matter if it's work or self-care or doing a healthy habit, when you come up against the feeling of, I just don't want to, and there's this sense of rebellion involved, I want you to pay attention, because that is literally your brain saying, I don't want to do anything right now. It is really an internal cry for help, and that's why it feels so vague. And that there's really there's really nothing substantial behind it. Usually when you don't feel like doing something because you're tired or you're frustrated or you're mad or there's something better you'd rather be doing, your brain can tell you that right away. But when you're having that feeling like, I just don't wanna, and you can't really identify anything more than that, just remember and take note that, hey, it might be time for me to just stop doing. And I know that sounds really unrealistic for a lot of people. Like if you have kids or a full-time job, or if you're going to school, or if you're just really stressed out right now, you might feel like, I can't just stop what I'm doing. But I promise you, every time you reward your brain with giving it what it wants, it will get clearer at telling you what it wants. And be careful, because inaction breeds overthinking. So if you just stop at the I don't want to, and you don't go any further, and you don't do anything about that feeling, you don't explore it, or you don't take the break that you need, or you don't, take the moment to go oh, maybe I need some self-care in this moment, your inaction will actually trigger you to start overthinking, overwhelming yourself, and over worrying, which is going to put you in the negative instead of just identifying oh, my brain doesn't want to do this right now. I can't really figure out why. Maybe I just need to take a break and do some self-care, something small, something easy, something you can do right in that moment. Like right now, if you're not driving or you're not on a treadmill and it's safe, maybe just take a little stretch, just do some kind of small incremental thing that you can consider a compassionate thing to do for yourself. Number 2, a feeling that you might be having is that you're in a default pattern of non-self-care. But if you start thinking and you have this realization that the reason you don't feel like doing self-care is because you're kind of in a set pattern of not taking care of yourself. If you've had past trauma, or you are a person that has consistent low self-esteem, self-care is not your default mode. It's not what your brain thinks about first thing in the morning or last thing before bed. You're not in a place where that is easy or where it's a routine or a pattern. So maybe not feeling like doing self-care just comes from the same old of not doing self-care. And so when you come up against that feeling and you're like, oh, that's what it is, I'm just not used to it. It's not my default to think of ways to take care of myself. That's when you really want to do what I talked about earlier, those tiny little 1% level ups. You want to go from where you're at and you want to think about realistic things. So for example, you and I, we're probably in totally different places in our journey of self-care and self-worth and self-compassion and all of those buzzwords that we talk about on this podcast. But wherever you are in your journey, you start where you are. And so that might look like taking another sip of water or stretching or, just standing and wiggling your body around, right? That might seem like a big deal, a huge effort because you're used to not doing anything for self-care. Whereas for me and where I'm at in my journey after years of making self-care the priority, for me, I immediately notice if I'm not getting my self-care time. And there is a huge red flag that goes off when my behavior shifts, when my attitude shifts, when my thoughts are automatically on autopilot in the duder about myself. That's when I know, whoops, that's time for self-care. So as you do these little tiny things that are realistic to where you're at for your own ability to take care of yourself, that's when you'll start to feel that pattern shifting. And then your brain will go like, oh, I like that. I like when I drink water when I'm thirsty. I like when I take a break and stretch or go outside and walk or do some of the things I'm going to be talking about later in the episode. Oh, I like when that happens. I like that feeling after a massage where my body has just been loved on and taken care of and appreciated and rubbed out. I like that feeling. And then your brain will start sending you more and more signals to help that pattern change. Another feeling that you might be having that's contributing to just not wanting to do self-care is feeling guilty. Now, this is kind of a sneaky underlining thing, and you might need to get a little further on in your journey before you discover this. But, newsflash, if you're not good at self-care, if you don't make yourself a priority, when you start to, you're going to feel guilty. Because it's not your default pattern. And because society has trained you to feel bad when you take care of yourself. Like, ladies, I'm specifically talking to my she's and they's out there that really, we have been conditioned that we are to take care of other people first. That our responsibilities to the house, to our partners, to our work, all of those things are more important than taking care of ourselves. And if we get all these things done, then we get time for ourselves. Or you're in that stuck pattern where the only kind of self-care you really get is zoning out in front of the TV or completely checking out 100%, like getting blasted drunk or, scrolliana for hours and hours, right? So it's important to remember that the feeling of guilty when you're doing self-care will prevent you from changing your pattern and doing more self-care. Because again, your brain's pretty inefficient in its feeling, thinking, and doing cycles. It really just looks at like, how do I avoid, the pain and the internal anguish of feeling guilty. Well, don't do self-care. That will take care of that. The problem is then you're not getting the self-care you need. So I'm here to let you know